there we go. Welcome all of you. One more time, this is the July webinar from Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary on planning in liminal times, church planning. And I invite you to read along with me. Not out loud, that won't work. I will read, you can read along silently. We always begin our webinars grounded in scripture. The scripture writing is from Proverbs, which I think is always so, I always think of Proverbs when I'm trying to find something that's sort of educational and teacher oriented. And this seems, so it seems an appropriate scripture. And this is from Proverbs 16, verses 1 through 4. The plans of the mind belong to mortals, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All one's ways may be pure in one's own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. The Lord has made everything for its purpose. This prayer is adapted from Mickey Scott Bay Jones. It just seemed an appropriate prayer space. Together we will recreate necessary space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world, we all carry scars, and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and to continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our necessary space together, and we will work on it side by side. Amen. I invite you all, wherever you are, to take a deep breath, to plant your feet firmly on the ground, to roll your shoulders back, to ground yourself in this place and in this time. I'm Charlotte Hand-Greason. I work for Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary. I'm an editor of Building Faith, and I coordinate the Thriving in Ministry and Launching into Ministry mentoring programs. I am joined this afternoon by two wonderful guests, the Reverend Ron Culmer, who serves St. Clair's in Pleasanton, California, and Christine Hides, who is a Methodist deacon serving in Illinois, Northern Illinois. They are both wonderful, wonderful pastors and leaders and ministers, and you'll see they have intersecting interests and ways of illuminating this topic. I'm also joined by the Reverend Catherine Malloy, a deacon in the United Methodist Church. She is the Director of Christian Formation and Discipleship at Lifelong Learning. And she will be behind the scenes. If you have questions, if you have things that you need to say or share, please use the chat box that you all chimed in on earlier. You can also use the question and answer box. She will respond to both of them. And I want to make a note that unlike most of our webinars, lost my train of thought completely. Unlike the normal scope and sequence of our webinars, there will not be a break in the middle for question and answers. You'll see as we go along, it seemed to make sense to weave them in. Please do not hesitate to ask your questions though. And if Catherine thinks that we should be interrupted with them, she will do so. And if not, we'll hold them until the end. So, Catherine, can you advance, please? This is the very aspirational slide that explains how our time will be spent. And I'm hoping that we can keep it to this. Tools and resources will be folded in a little bit. So it'll probably extend a little bit closer to, we'll probably close up a little bit closer to 3:50 than 3:45. But this is how we plan on spending our time. And Catherine, if you can advance the slide again. Why this topic? I think it sort of seems self-explanatory. We are Christian educators by and large. We are formation specialists. For the most part, our church program year is bound by a school year under normal circumstances. And for many, many people, this is the time of year where you're preparing for the program year ahead. And this particular year, there are lots of challenges. I paused because I actually think that there are challenges every year. And I think that every year we come up against something that seems like a giant rock in the middle of our road. But this year, obviously, in times of COVID, we are challenged beyond our normal frame and perspective. And so we're going to address that a little bit. And we're going to talk about how we might feel our way, experience our way towards planning, and then also ground ourselves in traditional tools for planning. And to remind ourselves that we follow a risen Christ, and we have rhythms and rituals that we believe in. And that's why we celebrate together. So, Ron, take it away.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it, Charlotte. So I think it's really important that we talk about the space that we're inhabiting right now. And what's interesting is that we're all in this together. I don't know about you, but I started out 2020 having some really great plans. And those plans have been upended. And I think probably the biblical model for this is to think about the wilderness experience. Think about the Old Testament lesson of the Hebrew people moving out of Pharaoh's land into the wilderness and not having arrived at the promised land. That's what liminal space is. So Richard Ward also describes it, and here is where you've got it. I know that there are some who say, oh my gosh, I can't stand people who read their slides, but I think it's also helpful to be able to hear it out loud. So here it is. It is when we are betwixt and between, have left one room but not yet entered the next room, in a hiatus between stages of life, stages of faith, jobs, loves, or relationships. It is that graced time when we are not certain or in control, when something genuinely new can happen. Much of the work of the biblical God and human destiny itself is to get people into liminal space and to keep them there long enough to learn something essential and genuinely new. It is the ultimate teachable space. That's what Rohr says about liminal spaces. And that's the time that we're inhabiting right now. It's really important for us to be able to do faithful planning, to pay attention to that, because the time which we're in calls us to change and adapt. Let's talk a little bit more about liminal spaces. Liminal, when we say that word, it means threshold. And we're on the verge of entering into something new. We don't exactly know what that new thing is. But it's also a time when we feel off. Liminal space isn't just a head trip. Liminal space is something you feel in your body. And at the very least, I don't know about you, but I have found that COVID-19 weight gain is a real deal, right? You feel it in your body. It's real. and you feel off. But liminal space is also an adaptive challenge. We need to change. Barbara Brown Taylor, and when she was talking about, she was doing a video on death and dying, and she had said that death has a way of smashing all our idols, and we're knocked over. And the things that we knew are just seem to be upended. That's liminal space. The skills that we normally use do not work. The things that you had planned, the things that you were going to do, the things that you had hoped to accomplish, you're living your life differently. The way in which you do church is different. The skills that we normally use do not work, and so we must adapt. And if you are familiar with the work of Ronald Heifetz, he talks about the adaptive challenge, but he also talks about technical fixes. And technical fixes are about trying to use the skills that we normally use in the midst of an adaptive challenge, and that they don't work. So next slide, please. This next piece is really mission critical. It's not a magic bullet by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a container to be able to help you do your planning going forward. And this work that we're going to take a look at has three meta questions and some additional questions. And it comes from Susan Beaumont, and Susan got the idea for this from another document that she fully says that she got this, she took this from another source. A little bit about Susan Beaumont. Susan, if some of you might remember the Alban Institute. And the Alban Institute was great at helping churches adapt and change and be able to do all sorts of things. And then they sort of went out of business. Part of it got taken over by Duke University, the Alban Institute part. And then the consultants went off and were doing their own thing. So Susan is a consultant at the Alban Institute. And we mentioned her in our resources. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But back to the questions. These questions, I think, are mission critical for you to be able to do planning and to think about what's next for you. So the first question she asked is, what have we lost? Which is an invitation for us to look at the flotsam and the jetsam of what was supposed to happen this year. And there are the 3 points that she wants us to mull over. If I were you, I would write these things down, take a journal, and sit with it. So this first part is dealing with what's gone on, because you've put time and energy and effort planning for 2020, and it's been upended. So what were we on the verge of discovering or accomplishing before the onset of the pandemic? What needs to move forward in different ways now? What was possible before that may not be possible for some time, if ever? What seems important before that feels superfluous now? So dealing with the flotsam and the jetsam of what you had planned, put together, tried to make happen. So next slide, please. And then the second question, and again, I would do this on a pad of paper and put, what did we assume? She says, what was undervalued before that may hold greater value now? What mattered about geography before that no longer matters? What margin or lack of margin was built into our old model of doing church? What new abundance are we experiencing now? Where are we experiencing scarcity now? It was not evident before. As you heard Charlotte say, I'm the priest at an Episcopal church, not a large Episcopal church, but it also happens to have a school. And because we've been upended by this virus, the things that we assumed before have changed. So one of the places that we had abundance was our school. That school cranks out more than $1 million a year. That's not all profit, just so you know. And now we have had, we have parents who, while they love our programs, at the same time are so afraid of the virus that we don't have very many children coming. And so we have to think differently about the way in which we do school. Another thing that has affected us as far as assumption is that, many of us were dealing with, and I mean this church-wise with a capital C, average Sunday attendance. That doesn't matter now anymore, right? Your church is bigger than my church. I have a small Episcopal church, does a lot of things, but it's a small Episcopal church. But since we've gone online, a tremendous thing has happened. We have found that our margin of who is coming to our worship service has expanded tremendously, so that people are participating not just from Pleasanton, but all over the country, and in some cases all over the world. And that may very well be happening to you. And so those are some of the things that we need to pay attention to as we think about what did we assume. Next slide, please.
Oh, hold on, Catherine, before you advance, hold on. I think that this question of assumption, and I know Christine will talk about it when we get to her portion of the webinar. This is such a huge, it's such a huge piece of what we're trying to work with. And it's always a piece of what we're trying to work with when we're planning. We do have to name our assumptions. And I think the dual pandemics with which we're working with in the United States, that of COVID and that of recognition of racial inequality and racial injustice, have burst open these assumptions. And I added into the resources, which we'll see at the very end, an article by Presbyterian pastor Marianne McKibben Dana on an anchor problem. And the anchor problem is when you frame a question and you make an assumption about the solution in the framing of your question. And I think that that's such a useful way of putting it. This sometimes, because of the way that we have been formed ourselves, we can't even ask a question that we think is going to open us up. What are we going to do now, without blockading ourselves in? And so assumption isn't always negative. There are opportunities, but I did want to jump in and point out that Christine is also going to talk about assumptions, and we have this idea that we're not making assumptions, and we're making assumptions all the time.
Oh, absolutely. And if we don't analyze those, and thanks for saying that, Charlotte, if we don't analyze those things, then the way we're not going to change, we're not going to have a freshness, we're not going to have a newness, and we're going to give up the opportunity that we have in the midst of this time to be able to change and to adapt and become something new and become something vital. So we have to look at those assumptions. Well said. And as you said before, Christine will talk more about that. And then the last question that I think is also mission critical: what wants to emerge? So we have to ask ourselves, what is our greatest asset now? What relationships will we need to, I can't fully see it, but be in or strengthen in the months ahead? What unique roles might our congregation play in the local, national, even global recovery? What long-term changes in the bigger picture would you like to be part of bringing to fruition? So to go back to what Charlotte was talking about, because of racial inequality, I serve a predominantly European American congregation, although it's pretty ethnically diverse, but the majority is European American. That said, my vestry has said, you know what, we have got to be able to engage this in real and substantive ways. And so the first temptation, of course, for us is to be able to say, oh, well, let's just do a book study. And of course, that does not make any systemic changes. So we're really doing a three-pronged approach. Certainly there is some reading, and people may or may not do that. we're going to spend some time really asking hard questions. We have some outside people who are going to help us do that. And then for the systemic piece, working with an organization called Visions Inc. that has done great work around race and relationships to help us move towards making some systemic changes. And the reason we do this is because we want to be able to live into the values in which we espouse. You know, for those of us who are Episcopalians, we point to the baptismal covenant over and over again. And this is an opportunity to be able to live more deeply into that. So that's some of the work that we're doing around what wants to emerge. And we've given ourselves a span of about 6 months to do that. Next slide, please. This quote comes from Douglas M. Bailey, who is also an Episcopal priest. He was a Baptist at one time, and he has also done some work at Wake Forest. But I really believe fluidity is mission critical in liminal times. You know, you can't beat yourself up. You have to be gentle with yourself in this process. And you have to remind yourself that this isn't about so much being an institution as it is about fluidity. Let's talk about that for a moment. So here's the quote. Let's be honest. We not change much more by a movement than by an organization? Organizations and institutions conjure up perceptions that are fixed in form, devoid of urgency, lacking in a way that invites us to become engaged and, more often than not, imagined as structures rather than as souls. On the other hand, movements lend themselves to being oriented to people. They are energetic, fluid, and visionary. They connect us to a cause on which our very life may well depend. A friend of mine often remarked, people do not engage themselves in causes that are feasible. We commit ourselves to movements that are irresistible. Show us a congregation that understands its ministries in terms of a movement. We will show you a congregation that is making an irresistible presence and witness in its neighborhood and its world. That's the opportunity that waits you if you take these things seriously as a part of your planning, as the pre-work for your planning. With that, next slide. Christine?
Hold on one sec. Let me.
Sure. Sorry.
I thought maybe we needed just a moment.
Yeah, sure.
So we have this image of the Lorenz attractor, and I was trying to find a way to pause and sort of allow people to incorporate this idea, the ideas of liminal space and Susan Beaumont's work of naming what we've lost, naming our assumptions, and dreaming into a new way of being who we are. And then Douglas Bailey's work around insisting that we shed the organization and we move into the movement. And I thought it might be helpful to take a step way, way, way back. This is chaos theory, and it just demonstrates that when we take those big steps back, we see the beauty. The chaos in the moment is chaotic, but it's also beautiful, and it is the opportunity to see something extraordinary. And the Lorenz attractor is the idea that even the smallest movement has massive impact, and that a butterfly is flapping its wings can be felt around the world. So I invite you all to take another deep breath, and I will turn it over to Christine. Thank you, Ron. Christine?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that pause, because I think we're moving from something akin to particle physics to the playground. So from chaos theory to teeter-totters. So I have been thinking about the shape of our plan and the shape of planning in churches and in faith formation ministries as we approach the fall. I think what we had in March when we began to shelter in place was, a crisis response. And I just want to give a word of encouragement, because I know a lot of our faith formation leaders learned technology. They made pivots they never thought possible, and we all did it very quickly. So I'm sure you haven't heard it enough. Thank you for doing that. But it was a hard pivot, and it was a crisis response. So how can we create that spirit of movement that is fluid and adaptive? Because we do not know what the months ahead will be. What we didn't know in March was that there might be some forward and backward movement in states and localities. Different things might be possible one month and perhaps not the next. So when I think about ministry in the fall, I think of something that has to be adaptive. But that teeter-totter is built on a fulcrum or a balance point, and that balance point in the sea of uncertainty that we are experiencing, that balance point is a constant, unchanging truth, that we have a mission, we have a purpose, we have what we call our why. As faith formation leaders in different denominations, we may say it differently, but it has to do with discipleship that leads to transformation. And it is theologically grounded, as Ron said, in our baptismal covenant. It is grounded in the Great Commission to go and make disciples for all the world. It's grounded in our church mission statements. So knowing your why, sometimes we think about, oh no, I have to form a task force and I have to spend 6 months wordsmithing it. I don't think it has to be that, especially in this time. I think having a succinct statement of what your purpose is and what gets you out of bed in the morning has a really practical application as well, in that we can, it keeps us motivated when we get down. It helps us to focus on what is important and what matters. And for my metaphor today, it is what we're building the teeter-totter plan on. So if you'll take us to the next slide, please. So that teeter-totter has a couple other components. So I like to think of online ministry as being on one side and our gathered in-person ministry being on the other. And then there's the board that connects the two. And so that, that's the basic teeter-totter. And what I hope that we are able to do in the fall is to be able to shift between gathered in-person ministry as we are able and online ministry without that hard, it's in March, it was like someone fell off one side of or jumped off the side of the teeter-totter on the playground and we came crashing down. So to be more fluid and to trust that the Holy Spirit is a part of that movement and a part of that spirit of play and creativity and creating this shape of plan. So if you'll take us to the next slide, please. So Ron talked a little bit about Ronald Heifetz's work and thinking about adaptive challenges versus technical challenges. For me, I think of in-person ministry as a technical challenge. It involves figuring out how many people can fit in the building and what policies and procedures you need to have in place. And you ask medical experts, and we know how to do ministry gathered in place. We just need to shift our policies and procedures and pay attention to our church and local and state and federal guidelines as we do that. What is a little bit more challenging and adaptive is the idea of having an online ministry or a hybrid online and in-person ministry. So that's kind of the challenge of what we are creating, is that we haven't maybe done it this way before. Perhaps we've talked about having more of an online presence, and perhaps we have some online tools, but we haven't made that shift into being a fully online organization that also meets in person. We have been what Carrie Newhoff calls in-person organizations that have an online presence, and we may need to shift the balance of that during this time. So if you'll go ahead and take us to the next slide. So pre-COVID-19 planning, I think we all knew what that looked like in these slides, which I think, Charlotte, you're making these available, right? In these slides, there are links. So we would create our yearly calendar based on the liturgical year. We would have our class rosters and participants, recruit teachers or leaders, choose the curriculum. And then for me, July often looked like filling in boxes in a lesson planning calendar. Oh, we're doing this lesson on this date with this person leading it. And my summer this year looks nothing at all like that. So, but I think pieces of this are helpful, so, which is why I included it. That, you know, we're still doing some of this work. It just may be a little different. So if you'll move this forward. We have, and I have approached planning for fall in a way that is similar to design thinking, if you're familiar with that. In ministry, Kenda Creasy-Dean, she has talked a lot about design thinking in terms of ministry and mission. But the first part of a design thinking approach is really to listen and to pay attention. And I think it's paying attention to the liminal space that we are in and what we are experiencing. I think it's also paying attention deeply to what is happening in the lives of our congregation members and the families and children that we serve. What is life like for them? Listening to what opportunities are emerging for them, and also what challenges. This planning process is also deeply rooted in our why, which I talked about. And then, you know, sort of a third step might be to name, because if your church has a back to church or reopening team, you know, sort of naming how you will get back together in person, that's a piece of the plan. But I've really been spending the bulk of our time on designing based on our assumptions and testing those assumptions. And we're doing some small experiments in July that will help us to plan for fall, adapt, listen again to what parents and families are experiencing. And the truth is that I think from day to day and week to week, people are experiencing many different things. I have not done a survey for that reason, because I feel like it, you know, ask me what we're having for dinner tonight, I might be able to tell you, but ask me if I want to attend a webinar next week, I'd be like, maybe. So you know, it's just a very strange liminal space to sort of take the temperature and listen, but keep your ears open, try some small experiments and test those.
Christine, there's been a request. Can you just briefly, like in 2 sentences, say what one of your experiments is going to be or has been?
Sure. So one of our experiments is creating the platform that connects digital and in-person ministry as we're able. We're not currently gathering in person. We had talked about this for a long time. We have a website. We don't have something like a Facebook group. That hasn't been something that's been helpful for our people. But so we needed an online platform, and we tested and researched, you know, maybe a dozen, and we've started with our children's ministry team and a few select parents in using that. So we're building it out now. We're asking them next week, what's working well? One of the things we know is that parents were overwhelmed with the number of e-learning apps that they had to manage quickly last spring. And so we knew that the tool that we were looking for had to be simple and one place to do the 3 main things we needed, which was to connect the people, to provide the class content, and also to provide some static content, because parents are looking for prayers at home. They're looking for, you know, rituals during COVID-19. So we needed those 3 things. So that's what we're experimenting with right now. So you can go ahead and go forward to the next slide. And that's a great question. Thank you for asking about some of the experiments. Our experiments are deeply rooted in the assumptions that we are making based on what we have heard and what we are reading in, you know, in the news and from other places. So we know that, I won't read all of these, but, you know, and some of these are paradoxical. So parents are cautious, not everyone at the same level of caution. That's understandable and okay. We know that if that we need to work with that assumption to think about not everybody is the same amount of cautious. So what does that look like when we gather again in person? But the paradoxical part is that parents and kids are both zoomed out but they also are really seeking spiritual direction and comfort and asking big questions about where God is when we're in the wilderness. So the way that we reach them through right now safely through Zoom or online, and their need, we have a little bit of a disconnect, and it's very challenging. We have been using a lot of trauma-informed distance learning ideas. So the idea that when collectively we're experiencing some level of trauma, so what do people need when they're experiencing trauma? We need connection, we need a sense of normalcy and routine, and we need some flexibility and grace in whatever we're doing, because even though you know, we're home all the time.
Hey, Christine.
Go ahead. Sorry. Oh, we froze. Am I back? Can you hear me, Catherine?
You are with us, Christine. I think Charlotte froze.
Okay.
She was trying to answer a question, but now the question has been dismissed. So I'll find it and I'll come back to you.
Okay, should I continue? I'm
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure you could hear me okay. Technology. So we've been looking at trauma-informed learning practices that have greatly helped us as we navigate through these assumptions. So these are some of our main ones. Yours may look similar or different. They can be very regional and very contextual, but being able to, like as Ron said, you know, write down what you're noticing, the assumptions that you're making, because the assumptions that we make definitely shape the solutions that we are creating. So I think I have one more slide to share.
Okay. Let's see, where was the question that
There was a question about what platform
yes,
you're using.
there we go.
Sure. Yes, so we are using Mighty Networks, and I learned of it through Vibrant Faith Catalyst. It may not, I think there are a variety of solutions. One of the resources I hope that I shared is a woman who runs a website called Cult of Pedagogy, which is geared toward schools and education and e-learning. She gives some really great ideas for all size organizations on digital learning platforms that you might use. Your digital learning platform can be as simple as a Google Doc, or as complex and robust as something a local school might use. And I do know of faith formation leaders who are choosing the same platform as their local schools because they know that parents know how to use it. So I don't want to say there's one right answer for everyone, but we're using Mighty Networks. I think that there are challenges and there are opportunities. And I think, I hope that our shifts that we're thinking about really lean more toward opportunities. Charlotte and Ron and I were talking the other day about how we've known that the school model of faith formation has not been serving the church well since at least the 1970s, and that families together and the power of relationships and discipleship are research-based and key. So I serve in a place that has historically been fairly age siloed, and COVID-19 is allowing us to shift toward families together. So it's research-based, but it's also practical in that if families are together, then they're kind of monitoring their own safety and what other guidelines about masks or sanitation and all of that and distance that have to be in place, that families are doing that as a unit rather than you know, having to have staff or volunteers manage that. In the same vein, moving from instruction to practice. And so you can read some of the rest, but these are the shifts that we have come up with, some practical, some based in things that we had hoped to do anyway, so some great opportunities, and some just practical about the size of things that we can do. So I hope that these shifts were helpful in kind of thinking about the practical teeter-totter part of planning.
Catherine, can you actually just go back a slide, go back to those shifts? Because I think, yeah, I mean, so we're going to open it up for questions if our attendees have questions, or if Christine, you have questions for Ron, or Ron, you have questions for Christine. But I thought actually that this one image just really sort of sums up where we are right now, as the space where the carrot is liminal. It's the space where God breaks in. It's the space that we're holding. It's an empty tomb almost. Like, we don't know what it's going to be like, but we know that the old way can't work right now, and in many cases wasn't working. And I just think while we have these questions, while we have this time for questions, I'm going to ask that this slide stay up. And Catherine, I know that you are on the question and answer side, so hit it.
Okay. You mean switch to it or ask questions?
The big question is, can you describe, please, Christine,
exactly
playlists?
Pathways and playlists. Everyone wants to know what.
Sure. So I can, and this is not my area of expertise. I lean on some colleagues for this, and I've linked some really great resources for pathways and playlists. But simply put, pathways consider them discipleship tracks. What they might be is age graded, but you could also organize pathways around a practice or a topic. So you could have, instead of saying all third graders meet together next year, you could say families who want to learn how to use your Bibles, that could be a pathway. So that's a pathway. And then a playlist are online resources that are available to families 24/7 that you have curated. I'll shout out Building Faith is a great place to find resources to share with your families. So you could create a top 10 list of prayer practices, and that could be a playlist. And you could put that on a website. You could put that, you put it in a Google Doc, you can put it anywhere. So that's kind of the simple definition of pathways and playlists.
Thank you.
That's awesome. So folks, someone highlighted that that many who are lonely and hungry for something to chew on are elderly folks. And there are some resources for families and such. Do you all have ideas for how to loop in older adults as well?
Just jump in, yeah.
Yep. So at St. Clair is one of the things that we have a large contingency of older adults, and many of them having a really difficult time getting online. Almost every week I hear, I wasn't able to get online, or, we do coffee hour online. I wasn't able to get to coffee hour, and so on and so forth. So one of the shifts that we're making right now in regards to worship is doing and again, it's an outdoor service. We gave it a name because we wanted to make sure it had a container, so it's called Good News from the Lot. And it is a worship service where people stay in their cars. They can either print, it's morning prayer. You can either print it if they're tech savvy enough, or they could just have their Book of Common Prayer. And we do this by radio, a radio broadcaster, what's the FCC calls a Part 15 device, is about $150. And the clarity on that is marvelous. The fidelity is so good that it sounds like you're already there, like you're there. And part of the reason we knew that we needed to make this shift is because I had a person in my congregation who missed coming to church regularly so much that early in the morning he would come and he would drive and park illegally and do the morning prayer office because he missed being there so much. So we made this shift, and that's happening this coming Sunday. I suspect we're going to have a very crowded parking lot because there's just a desire for those ways of being. It's hard to make that shift. So that's one of the things we're doing.
Absolutely. Someone else in the chat suggested that they've had reported that they've had success with Bible studies using freeconferencecall.com because lots of older adults do have a telephone. And something that I personally have done is that there's a lady from my church that I know technology is not her favorite. However, she does want to be involved in our church. And so on Sunday mornings, I'll give her a call, and she knows how to do it at this point, but it's just helpful to have on the older end of the millennial group, but have a millennial on the phone that can talk through, okay, here, like I'll send you the link so that you can just tap on how to go to the live stream for worship and kind of walk through those steps together. And so I've also heard of folks having a sort of partner system that way to help get older adults involved in the online things that are happening. Let's see, questions are coming hard and fast now.
There's been a lot of questions about conference call and like how to do it. Some technical questions. Lene, I saw your question about how are you incorporating new people. I love all the names for the tech ushers and the Zoom vergers. I love that.
Yes.
There was a question about listening, and I'm wondering, since you both spoke about listening, both Christine and Ron, how are you doing this big listening?
Yeah, this is also fairly old school for listening. We very early on started emailing individual emails, which for us, we're a medium-sized church, so it's about 150 families. We emailed all of our parents and just basically said, how are you doing? We did that once right after Easter, and then we did it again at the end of the school year. And we will be doing a mailing card because we're sensing right now in our listening to social media that there's a lot of anxiety around return to school. That's pretty widespread. So we would like to send a snail mail note of encouragement to our families. And when you reach out in that way, just pay attention and listen to what they might email you back or a conversation. And we just record everything we've heard in one kind of running Google Doc. And then we can look at that and pick apart the threads that we're hearing.
So some of what I have to say reflects what Christine has said. We have people who are not tech savvy, so we do send things out by letter. And it's really important. Number one, some people are really anxious about what is the status of the church and the school right now. And so we have to be able to say as clearly and concisely as possible, here's what's happening, here's our financial standing, and to be able to communicate that. But also, one of the things that Heifetz talks about is that part of this work in the adaptive challenge is to move from being on the dance floor, that is being in the midst of doing all this work, to imagine yourself being on a balcony and looking down. And as you make that shift, part of it is to give some of the work back to the people. So at St. Clair's, what that's looked like is I've said to our vestry, which is our board, I need you to share in some of this pastoral work. I need you to take one page from the directory, each of you, and make a phone call. Don't ask for money. But check and see how people are doing. And you will be surprised at the response you get. And they absolutely love it. And so they've done it twice now, and I'm going to have them continue to do that because as far as I'm concerned, ministry is best shared. If you're carrying the onus all by yourself, that's not good. You're going to burn yourself out, and your leaders need to share in that work. So that's part of what it looks like for us.
I love that idea, Ron. I've heard folks say that that has been really life-giving for their congregation. And I think another great thing about that is that you're equipping the church, to be community in the way that they, I mean, it's obviously different from how they would be in person, and yet they're still getting those interactions with people, which is wonderful. So we only have a couple more minutes. So what if we go ahead and answer, how are you, there's a question about how large family groups are you anticipating, which I don't totally understand. Do you, when you're, I think it might've been in relation to like how many families you allow to come to something. Like, how are you including singles in that? Like, how do you count families? And then what's an example of the most successful thing that has worked in your context?
I can answer in terms of when I say family, probably a better term would be household. So we have a very chopped up building. We don't have a lot of large spaces. Many of our rooms could only accommodate, 4 or 5 people socially distant. So we've identified one room that we would be able to use, and in order to keep household units together, we would have a table. So the reservation system in the fall, provided that nothing changes, would be for families to reserve a table in this large room that has an exterior door and kind of all those, mitigating all the things. We'd like to be outside as much as possible, but it'll be by family units at a table. And that'll be based on our capacity. We're in the state of Illinois, so we follow those guidelines in terms of how many people we're allowed to have.
I'm in the state of California, and the numbers are off the charts. And so we had already determined that we would look at the possibility of coming back in September. And to be honest with you, if I'm really being truly candid with you, I think 2020 is off the table for being back in the sanctuary. And that's why some of this work that we've talked about is so really important. Someone had also asked, what is some of the most successful things that have happened? I've named some, but without going into great details, just know that it's really technical for us. I use a program called Switcher Studio, which is an iPhone operating system based program that allows us to use multiple iPhone, iPads to be able to do the service. And I couple that with Vimeo, which allows us to do multiple platforms. So it's Facebook, it's YouTube, it's Vimeo, it's whatever else we want. And that permits us to be able to, so rather if a person doesn't like Facebook and doesn't want to go to a Facebook Live, all they have to do is just go to our website, and they're able to click the things they want, and they're able to watch the worship service or be able to watch the funeral service, because I've had a few of those as well that were either outdoors or recorded privately. And that has really moved people's hearts. If you're really interested in the details around that, feel free to send me an email.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Christine. Email addresses are part of our slides. And all of this, again, all of our resources, all of the links in Christine's slides, the prior poem from the very beginning, all of that will be a part of the deck that you receive, along with the recording when that arrives in your inbox. It's also, if you logged in through, or if you came to this webinar through Building Faith, the post will be updated so that all of this will live as long as Building Faith is a platform. It'll be in perpetuity there. But thank you, Christine and Ron, so much. We are so grateful for your time and your energy and your ability to communicate what is working and where your fears are and where your hopes are. It has been a wonderful resource. To all of our attendees, we invite you to join us every Thursday from 1:15 to 2:45 for office hours. They are hosted by one or two members of Lifelong Learning. You can always find us on Facebook. This will also be a part of the slide deck. And I'm sorry, Catherine, to make you jump around in the slide deck. Next month, totally different way of doing planning. Next month, our webinar will be hosted by Sarah Bentley Alred, and it will be off-screen ministry ideas for fall. And it will be Imani Driscoll and Samantha Clare as our guests. And I think that is all of the information. It's not even 4 o'clock. I have achieved my goal. Fantastic. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for spending an hour of your very precious resource time with us. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you all so much.
It was great to work with you, Ron. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you
Take
all.
care.
Take care.
Bye,
God
guys.
bless.
Bye-bye.